The air in Le Ciel was worth more than the gold leaf that shimmered on its desserts. It was a rarefied atmosphere, 60 stories above the Chicago skyline, where fortunes were made and dismantled over plates of seared scallops and glasses of vintage Bordeaux. For Clara Hayes, the air tasted of exhaustion and disinfectant. At 22, she wore her crisp black waitress uniform like a suit of armor, shielding her from a world she served but could never inhabit. Her life was a frantic sketch in charcoal, a cramped apartment in Pilsen, a mountain of medical bills, and the aching, ever-present silence of her younger brother Leo. Every clink of silverware against porcelain was a sound Leo would never hear again. A brutal hit-and-run 6 months prior had stolen his hearing, plunging the vibrant, music-loving teenager into a soundless void. Clara's tips, every last dollar, were funneled into his therapy, his specialized school, and the desperate, long-shot hope of cochlear implant surgery. She moved through the opulent dining room with a practiced, unobtrusive grace, her artist's eye cataloging the details, the bored expression on a society wife, the nervous twitch of a CEO closing a deal, the subtle language of bodies that often spoke louder than words. Tonight, the restaurant's low hum of power was amplified by the arrival of Julian Thorne. At 36, he was less a man and more a myth, the enigmatic head of Thorne Industries, a global logistics empire built on cold, hard data and ruthless efficiency. His face, all sharp angles and unforgiving planes, was a mask of bored indifference. He was a creature of routine and control, and he was rarely seen with family. But tonight was an exception. With him was his mother, Eleanor Thorne. She was a portrait of forgotten elegance, draped in dove-gray silk, a magnificent sapphire pendant resting at her throat. Yet a profound stillness clung to her, a tragic disconnect from the glittering world around her. As Julian spoke in low, clipped tones to a business associate, Eleanor's gaze was fixed on the sprawling city below, a panorama of lights she could see but whose symphony she could no longer hear. She was an empress exiled in a castle of silence. The restaurant manager, a perpetually anxious man named Mr. Dubois, fluttered around the Thorne table like a nervous moth. "Mr. Thorne, your usual table is perfect, yes? The Côte de Boeuf for two?" He gushed, his deference almost painful to watch. Julian gave a curt nod, his attention still on his phone. "And for my mother, the Dover sole. No almonds, steamed asparagus." Dubois turned to Eleanor, his professional smile stretching unnaturally wide. He leaned in close, raising his voice to a near shout, enunciating each syllable with patronizing slowness. "Mrs. Thorne, would you care for some water?" Eleanor didn't even blink. Her expression remained one of distant melancholy, her eyes locked on the window. A faint, painful flush crept up her neck, a telltale sign of shame that Clara, a connoisseur of such subtle agonies, recognized instantly. It was the sting of being treated not as a person, but as a problem to be solved with volume. Julian's jaw tightened into a granite ridge. "She can't hear you, Dubois. The volume of your voice is irrelevant." The words were like chips of ice. "Just bring the water." He hated this ritual, the public displays of awkwardness, the clumsy attempts by others that only underscored his mother's isolation. A degenerative disease had claimed her hearing over the last decade, and with it, the music that had been her life's passion. She had been a world-renowned concert pianist. Now the grand piano in her penthouse sat as a silent, monolithic tombstone to the life she had lost. Julian could buy her anything in the world, except the one thing she craved, a simple, effortless conversation. From her station by the service bar, Clara watched, and her heart clenched with a familiar, vicarious pain. She saw Leo and Eleanor's quiet dignity. She saw the countless doctors, clerks, and relatives who had shouted at her brother as if he were merely stubborn, not deaf. She had seen a brilliant, funny boy begin to retreat into himself, not because he couldn't communicate, but because the world was too impatient to learn his new language. Dubois scurried away, his face a mask of mortification. The business associate cleared his throat and quickly resumed a monologue about shipping routes in the South China Sea. Julian placed a hand on his mother's arm. and when she turned, he began to mouth his words with exaggerated movements. It was a clumsy, frustrating pantomime, a language they both despised. He was trying to include her, to bridge the chasm, but the effort only highlighted its immense, impossible width. Clara felt an impulse, a reckless surge of empathy that defied every rule in the employee handbook. Mr. Dubois' cardinal rule was gospel. Never engage a guest unless directly addressed, especially not a thorn. But the image of Eleanor's profound loneliness resonated with the grief she felt for her brother. It was a professional gamble, but it felt like a human necessity. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she smoothed her apron and began the long walk across the marble floor toward the most powerful table in Chicago. The air around it seemed to crackle with an invisible force field of wealth and influence. As she approached, the associate's voice trailed off. Mr. Dubois, catching sight of her from across the room, froze mid-stride, his eyes widening in sheer terror. Julian Thorne looked up from his phone, his gaze, the color of a winter sky over Lake Michigan, instantly locking onto her. There was no curiosity in his eyes, only the cold annoyance of a man whose time was being wasted. "We don't need anything," he said, his voice a low, dismissive rumble intended to send her scurrying back to the shadows. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her gaze fixed, not on the billionaire, but on the silent, elegant woman at his side. She offered a small, respectful inclination of her head. Then she lifted her hands. With a grace and precision that felt as innate as breathing, her fingers began to move, to dance, to speak. A warm, genuine smile touched Clara's lips as she signed. "Good evening, Mrs. Thorne. My name is Clara. It is a pleasure to have you with us tonight. I hope the city lights are singing to you." Time at table 12 ceased to exist. The associate stared, his jaw slack. Mr. Dubois looked as if he might faint. And Julian Thorne's face, a moment before a carefully constructed mask of control, was now a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock. The most profound reaction, however, came from Eleanor. Her eyes, which had been clouded with a distant sorrow, snapped into sharp, brilliant focus. She blinked once, twice, as if waking from a long and dreary dream. A wave of disbelief, then a tidal wave of astonished joy washed over her features, erasing years of quiet resignation. Her posture, once slumped in defeat, straightened into regal alignment. Slowly, her own hands rose from her lap. They trembled slightly, her fingers clumsy from years of disuse, like a musician finding her instrument after a long, forced silence. You speak the language of my soul." She signed back, her expression one of breathtaking wonder. In that single, silent exchange, the young waitress from Pilsen had just detonated a quiet bomb in the center of the billionaire's meticulously controlled world. The hushed symphony of Le Ciel had fallen silent, and for a few stretched-out heartbeats, the entire universe seemed to revolve around the eloquent, voiceless conversation unfolding 60 stories in the sky. The silence that followed was thick enough to be carved. Julian Thorne stared, his analytical mind, accustomed to processing terabytes of data, failing to compute the scene before him. He had spent a fortune on audiologists, experimental hearing aids, and even private tutors for himself in a frustratingly futile attempt to learn American Sign Language. He had mastered corporate takeovers and hostile negotiations, but the fluid grammar of ASL had remained stubbornly beyond his grasp. Yet here, a waitress in this very restaurant was conversing with his mother more fluently than he had in a decade. Clara, acutely aware of the astonished eyes on her, maintained her focus on Eleanor. She felt a powerful, immediate kinship with the older woman, an unspoken understanding that vaulted the vast canyon between their lives. "I learned from my younger brother." Clara signed, her movements fluid and expressive. "He lost his hearing recently. He has your same thoughtful eyes." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, shimmering like her sapphire pendant. It wasn't just the miracle of communication. It was the content of the message. Clara hadn't seen her as a disability or a logistical problem. She had seen her as a person, complimented her, and connected her to another human being through a shared, gentle observation. The compliment landed directly in her heart, unmolested by clumsy mouthing or a hastily scribbled note. Eleanor's hands moved with growing confidence, a story tumbling from her fingertips. My husband, Robert, he learned from me when I first became ill. He was my ears, my partner in everything, but he passed away 4 years ago. Since then, she made a sign for quiet that was so profound it seemed to absorb the sound from the room. It has been an unbearable silence. She glanced at her son, her expression a complex mixture of deep love and sorrow. Julian tries, but his hands are built for signing contracts, not for charting the landscapes of the heart. Watching them, Julian was caught in a maelstrom of emotions. Astonishment, a sharp pang of guilt, and a strange, unfamiliar flicker of hope. He saw his mother's face, animated with a life he hadn't seen since before his father's death. The fine mist of melancholy that always shrouded her had evaporated, replaced by a radiant inner light. He had been trying to fill her silence with things, art, travel, luxury, when all she had ever needed was a language. Clara responded with a gentle empathy that was both profound and respectful. Silence doesn't have to be an empty room. It can be a garden. It just needs someone who knows how to cultivate it. Before Eleanor could reply, Julian finally found his voice. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. The dismissive edge was gone, replaced by an urgent, raw curiosity. Clara finally turned her gaze to him. Her professional composure clicked back into place, though her heart was still performing a frantic staccato against her ribs. "My brother Leo, sir. An accident 6 months ago. ASL is how we talk now. It's our language." Mr. Dubois was now hovering at the edge of the table, wringing his hands, his face ashen. He was convinced he was about to lose the restaurant's most valuable patron. He opened his mouth to apologize, to drag Clara away, but Julian silenced him with a single, sharp wave of his hand. "Leave her," he commanded, his eyes never leaving Clara. He then turned to his stunned associate. "Frank, I think we're done for the night. My driver will take you wherever you need to go. We'll continue this tomorrow." It was an undeniable dismissal. The man, sensing the tectonic shift that had just occurred, gathered his briefcase and departed with a mumbled farewell. The vast table now held only 3 people: Julian, Eleanor, and Clara, who stood awkwardly, trapped between her role as a waitress and her new, undefined position as a miracle worker. "Please," Julian said, his voice softer than she could have imagined. "Sit," he gestured to the empty chair. "Sir, I can't. I'm on the clock," Clara stammered, hyper-aware of Mr. Dubois' panicked face in her periphery. "No, you're not," Julian stated, a simple declaration of fact. "As of this moment, you are my mother's guest." He looked over at the terrified manager. "Dubois, add a $5,000 tip to my bill for the staff kitchen, and send a bottle of the 78 Romani Conti to our table. My guest will be joining us." Mr. Dubois blinked, the sheer monetary force of the command shocking him into mute obedience. He simply nodded and fled. Overwhelmed, Clara slowly sank into the plush, velvet chair. It felt like stepping through a looking glass into an alternate reality. Eleanor beamed at her, her entire being suffused with a joy so pure it was almost tangible. She reached across the table and gently touched Clara's hand. "Tell me about your brother," Eleanor signed. "Tell me everything." For the next 2 hours, as the sky outside deepened from indigo to black, an extraordinary conversation unfolded. Clara, initially crippled by nerves, soon found herself acting as a seamless bridge between a mother and son who were, in many ways, speaking to each other for the first time in years. She told them about Leo's wicked sense of humor, his passion for street art, and the crushing financial burden of the specialized school that was his only lifeline. She spoke of the beauty and nuance of ASL, explaining how it wasn't just a system of signs, but a language of the face, the body, the very soul. Julian listened, utterly captivated. He learned more about his mother's inner life in those 2 hours than he had in the past 4 years. He learned she felt like a ghost in her own home, that she despised the pity in people's eyes, and that what she missed most wasn't the sound of an orchestra, but the simple sound of his father laughing at a bad joke. Through Clara's graceful interpretations, Eleanor's sharp, witty, and deeply intelligent personality emerged from its silent prison. He also found himself watching Clara. He saw the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she translated, the passion that illuminated her eyes when she spoke of her brother, the quiet, unshakable dignity that radiated from her. She wasn't awed by his wealth or intimidated by his power. In this space, she held all the cards. She was the gatekeeper to a world he had been locked out of. As the evening drew to a close, Julian knew that a simple, extravagant tip would be a profound insult to what had transpired. This wasn't a service rendered, it was a resurrection. An idea, bold and unconventional, began to form in his mind. "Clara," he said, leaning forward, his voice serious, "I have a business proposal for you. It would require you to leave this job." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She thought of her overdue rent, of Leo's tuition. "What kind of proposal, sir?" "My mother is the honorary chair of the Thorn Foundation's annual benefit concert. It's the pinnacle of her social calendar, and for the last 4 years it has been her personal hell. A night of smiling and nodding while feeling utterly alone. It's in 3 weeks. I want to hire you as her personal interpreter and companion for the entire period. I want you by her side for fittings, planning meetings, lunches. I want her to experience the entire process, not just endure the final event." He paused, letting the weight of the offer settle. "I will pay you $100,000. Clara's breath hitched. $100,000. It was a sum so vast it felt like a number from a different language. It was Leo's surgery. It was an end to the constant, grinding fear. It was a lifeline woven from gold. Before she could process the number, Eleanor, who had been watching Julian's lips intently, turned to Clara, her eyes shining with desperate hope. "Please," and she signed, her hands trembling. "Please be my voice. Be my friend." Looking at the hopeful face of the elegant woman before her and thinking of the future it could secure for the brother she adored, Clara knew her life had just irrevocably fractured. The path she had been on, a predictable slog of exhaustion and worry, had just vanished. "Yes," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "I'll do it." The next morning, Clara's world shifted on its axis. A sleek black town car, silent as a shadow, was waiting outside her weathered brick apartment building, causing a stir among her neighbors. The driver, a man named Thomas with polite, watchful eyes, addressed her as Ms. Hayes and ushered her into a leather-scented interior. They didn't go to an office. They ascended to the clouds, to the Thorn residence, a sprawling penthouse that occupied the entire top floor of a historic Gold Coast building. As Clara stepped from the private elevator into the foyer, she was met by a world of muted colors, soaring ceilings, and art that belonged in a museum. A severe-looking woman with hair pulled into a tight chignon introduced herself as Mrs. Gable, the household manager. Her gaze swept over Clara's simple blouse and clean but worn jeans with a flicker of barely concealed condescension. "Mrs. Thorn is in the conservatory," she announced, her voice as crisp and starched as her uniform. Clara was led through rooms that felt more like elegant public spaces than a home. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but it had the sterile chill of a gilded cage. She found Eleanor in a glass-walled room overflowing with orchids, a book lying unread in her lap. When she saw Clara, her face broke into a smile of such genuine, unadulterated joy that it instantly warmed the opulent room. "You're real," Eleanor signed, rushing to greet her. "I was so afraid I had imagined you." "I'm very real," Clara signed back, her own smile finally feeling natural. "And very nervous." Their first day was a whirlwind. Clara learned that Eleanor was not just a grieving widow, but a sharp, formidable intellect who had once served on the board of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. With Clara as her bridge, Eleanor began to re-engage with her world. She held a video conference with the benefits event planner, her input sharp and decisive. She made calls via a relay interpreter to old friends, her signed conversations full of laughter and gossip. Present at one of these planning meetings was Julian's uncle, Graham Thorn. Graham was the executive director of the Thorn Foundation, a man whose charm was as polished as his Italian leather shoes, and whose eyes held the cold, assessing glint of a predator. He greeted his sister-in-law with an effusive kiss on both cheeks before turning his full attention to Clara. "So you're the one," he said, his voice a smooth, buttery baritone. Julian hasn't stopped talking about the miracle worker from Le Ciel. I'm just happy to be of service to Mrs. Thorne, Clara replied, her professional guard firmly in place. Of course, Graham purred, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. It's a marvelous story, a true fairy tale. Quite the opportunity for a young woman in your circumstances. The word hung in the air, laden with insinuation. He had already written the script in his head. A desperate girl from the wrong side of town, a vulnerable, wealthy matriarch, and a clear path to the family fortune. He observed them for the rest of the afternoon, a silent, smiling viper. He saw the easy camaraderie, the genuine affection already blossoming between Clara and Eleanor, and his smile tightened. For years, Eleanor's deafness had made her a passive figurehead, a rubber stamp for his decisions within the foundation. An empowered Eleanor, with a direct, unfiltered line of communication to the world, was a threat to his carefully managed kingdom. That evening, Graham found Julian in his home office. She's quite something, he began casually, helping himself to a whiskey from the crystal decanter. Very poised. Clara is professional and exceptionally skilled, Julian corrected, not looking up from his laptop. Oh, no doubt, Graham said. But don't you find the whole thing a bit convenient? This girl with this one, very specific skill happens to be waiting on your mother's table on the one night you take her out this year? We know nothing about her, Julian. Her background, her debts. A story like this is a con artist's dream. I saw her employee file. She's been working 2 jobs to support her deaf brother since she was 18, Julian stated, his voice firm. A perfect sob story, Graham countered smoothly. The oldest trick in the book. All I'm saying is, be careful. You're giving her unfettered access to mother, to this family. You of all people know how many sharks circle this fortune. Julian finally looked up, his gaze like steel. My mother is happy for the first time in 4 years. That is all that matters. But after Graham left, the poison of his words began to seep in. Julian was a man who trusted data, not people. He built his empire by anticipating threats and mitigating risk. His decision to hire Clara had been an uncharacteristic leap of faith, an emotional impulse. Graham's warnings resonated with the deeply ingrained cynicism that had protected him his entire life. Was Clara Hayes a godsend? Or was she simply the most gifted grifter he had ever encountered? He tried to dismiss the thought, but it lingered, a dark, insidious shadow in the corner of his mind. In the days that followed, Clara's bond with Eleanor deepened into a genuine friendship. They discovered a shared dry sense of humor and a mutual love for art history. Clara, using her own artistic vocabulary, would describe paintings to Eleanor in ASL, her hands sculpting the brushstrokes of a Monet or the sharp, emotional lines of a Kollwitz. In return, Eleanor shared stories of her life as a musician, the thrill of a sold-out Carnegie Hall, the quiet joy of composing in her studio at dawn. One afternoon, while sorting through old photo albums, Clara noticed something. Eleanor was wearing a pair of discreet, flesh-colored hearing aids. Are those helpful at all? Clara signed, curious. Eleanor grimaced. A little. They amplify certain frequencies, but it's mostly just painful, distorted noise. Graham insists I get the newest model every year, but they always feel the same. These ones are particularly uncomfortable. The mold feels wrong. Later that week, Clara was helping Eleanor sort through a stack of mail when she saw a bill from a high-end audiology clinic, personally expensed by Graham Thorne. The itemized list included custom-molded, state-of-the-art digital hearing aids, Thorne Industries' premier model. The price was astronomical, but Clara knew, with an artist's eye for detail, that the devices in Eleanor's ears were not new. The casing was slightly yellowed, the model one she had seen in a brochure 2 years ago when first researching options for Leo. It was a small thing, a tiny dissonant detail in a symphony of wealth, but it felt wrong. It was a lie. Why would Graham lie about something like that? She filed the observation away, a quiet alarm bell ringing in the back of her mind. Julian, meanwhile, found himself manufacturing reasons to work from the penthouse. He'd sit in his study, the door ajar, observing the silent, animated conversations between his mother and Clara. He saw his mother, once a fragile porcelain doll, now vibrant and engaged, laughing with a freedom he hadn't seen in years. It was all because of Clara. His admiration warred constantly with his suspicion. One evening, he found her in the library sketching Leo's face in a small notebook from memory. The likeness was so vivid, so full of life and love. It was breathtaking. "You're very talented," he said, his voice startling her. She closed the book quickly. "Just a hobby." "It's more than a hobby, Clara," he said, stepping closer. "This is a gift." "I was accepted to the School of the Art Institute," she admitted quietly, "on a full scholarship. But then, life changed." She didn't need to elaborate. He knew she meant Leo's accident, the financial ruin that followed. They stood in the quiet, book-lined room, the space between them humming with an unspoken tension. He was seeing another layer of her, a sacrificed dream, a quiet strength that humbled him. "You are a remarkable woman, Clara Hayes," he said, his voice low and sincere. The warmth in his gaze terrified her. She was beginning to see the man behind the myth, the lonely son who loved his mother but was shackled by his own cynicism. And worse, she was beginning to care for him. This was a job, she reminded herself fiercely, a temporary contract. Becoming emotionally entangled would be a catastrophic error in judgment. "I should go check on your mother," she said, pulling away and leaving him alone in the library, her heart pounding a frantic, treacherous rhythm. The night before the benefit concert, Graham made his move. He delivered a thick sealed file to Julian's study. "I think you need to see this," he said, his voice grave. "I had my security team do a deep dive for your mother's protection." Inside was a detailed, brutal accounting of Clara's life. Foreclosure notices on her family's home, high-interest payday loans taken out in her name, a copy of her father's death certificate listing suicide after a gambling addiction had bankrupted them. To Graham, it was a weapon. To a cynic like Julian, it was confirmation of his deepest fears. It wasn't a story of resilience. It was a portrait of absolute cornered desperation. A woman that desperate would do anything for a $100,000 payday and the chance at a much bigger prize. The Thorne Foundation benefit was the crown jewel of Chicago's philanthropic season, held in the soaring, magnificent atrium of the city's Symphony Hall. Clara felt like an imposter in a borrowed fairy tale. She wore a deep sapphire gown, a loan from Eleanor's closet, that made her feel both beautiful and entirely out of place. At her side, Eleanor was a revelation. She was no longer a passive observer, but the radiant, confident host. With Clara as her voice, she commanded the room, moving from a witty debate with a senator to a heartfelt conversation with the parents of a deaf child the foundation supported. For the first time, people weren't seeing Eleanor Thorne's disability. They were seeing her brilliance. Julian watched them from across the room, a glass of scotch in his hand, his face an unreadable mask. Graham's report lay like a block of ice in his gut. Every smiling, graceful gesture from Clara now seemed like a calculated move in a long con. "She's playing you, Julian. She's playing all of you," his uncle's voice echoed in his head. Yet as he watched her gently touch his mother's arm to get her attention, as he saw the genuine warmth in her eyes when she translated a joke, his mind and heart were at war. Nothing about her seemed false. The main event of the evening was a performance by a world-renowned string quartet. After their final, breathtaking note, Julian took the stage. He gave a polished speech about the foundation's work, and then he did something that sent a hush through the audience. "This year, we were reminded that a voice is the most powerful gift we can give," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd and landing directly on Clara. "In that spirit, the Thorne Foundation is making an unprecedented, immediate donation of $2 million to fund cochlear implant surgeries for children at the city's public hospital." The room erupted in applause. Eleanor, beside Clara, was overcome with emotion, her hands flying as she expressed her pride and joy. But Clara felt a chill. Julian's gaze wasn't warm or appreciative. It was cold, hard, and assessing, as if she were a problem he had just solved with a checkbook. After the speech, as guests mingled, Graham approached them, a triumphant gleam in his eye. "Julian, a word? It's about the foundation's accounts." He gave Clara a dismissive glance. "A family matter." Julian nodded. "Clara, please ensure my mother has another glass of champagne." It was a clear, cold dismissal. She was staff. The fragile, tentative connection they had shared in the library was gone, severed by the brutal slash of his wealth and power. Heart sinking, she turned to Eleanor. But as she watched Julian walk away with his uncle, she saw Graham hand him a thick file. She saw Julian open it, his face darkening, his jaw clenching. He looked up from the page, his gaze finding her across the crowded room. His eyes were no longer wintry, they were frozen glaciers. In that instant, Clara knew. Graham hadn't just planted a seed of doubt, he had presented a harvest of lies. And Julian, the man who trusted data over people, had just been handed a damning, expertly crafted story, a story with her as the villain. The evening ended in a blur of fake smiles and hollow pleasantries. Clara escorted a tired but happy Eleanor back to the penthouse. The older woman gave her a tight hug before retiring, her eyes shining with unshed tears of gratitude. "Thank you, Clara," she signed, her touch gentle on Clara's arm. "Tonight I felt like myself again. Thank you for giving me back my music." The words, which should have been a triumph, felt like a eulogy. The moment Eleanor's bedroom door clicked shut, Julian's voice sliced through the grand living room silence. "My office. Now." It was the voice of a CEO about to liquidate a failed asset. The office was a cavernous space, walled with dark mahogany and a panoramic view of the glittering city. Julian stood not behind his desk, but in the center of the room, like a prosecuting attorney. The file Graham had given him was on the desk, splayed open. $100,000, he began, his voice dangerously quiet. "I imagine a sum like that could solve a lot of problems for someone with your history." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "Mr. Thorne, I don't understand." "Oh, I think you do," he sneered. "I understand everything now. Your father's gambling debts, the foreclosure, the desperation. It's all here." He gestured to the file. "Graham was right to be worried. I was a fool to be so sentimental." He began to pace, his movements tight and controlled, like a predator circling its prey. "Let's piece it together. A clever, beautiful girl, drowning in debt. She stumbles upon the perfect mark, a lonely, deaf old woman and her guilty billionaire son. What a magnificent stroke of luck. Or was it? Each word was a physical blow. The beautiful sapphire gown suddenly felt like a cheap costume. "It wasn't like that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw your mother was lonely. I wanted to help." "Help?" He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You saw an angle, and you played it masterfully. The selfless, caring waitress. You preyed on her isolation. You preyed on my guilt. The stories about your brother, the interest in art, the feigned shock at the close. A flawless performance." He stopped directly in front of her, his glacial eyes boring into hers. "Tell me, Clara, what was the ultimate goal? A permanent position? A ring? Did you really think you could sign your way into the Thorne family fortune?" The sheer, calculated cruelty of his attack stole her breath. He had taken every genuine moment, every shared confidence, and twisted it into something grotesque and mercenary. He was not just firing her, he was annihilating her. Tears of fury and humiliation stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She lifted her chin, meeting his cold fury with a sudden blazing fire of her own. "You know what your problem is, Mr. Thorne. You're so suffocated by your own wealth that you can't conceive of a single human action that isn't transactional. You can't imagine kindness without a price tag because it's not a currency you trade in." Her voice, though shaking, was clear and strong. "You think this is about money? You think I'm the one who's cheating you?" She took a step closer, her own eyes now flashing. "Then let me ask you something. I saw the invoice for your mother's state-of-the-art hearing aids, the ones your Uncle Graham bought her. Why don't you go ask your mother why those expensive, top-of-the-line devices are actually a 5-year-old model that are so poorly fitted they cause her physical pain? Why don't you ask why a man in charge of a billion-dollar foundation would cut corners on his own sister-in-law's medical care?" Julian stared, momentarily stunned into silence by her counterattack. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. Clara saw her opening and pressed on, her voice ringing with the clarity of truth. You stand here in your palace of glass and steel, judging my desperation, while the real rot is right here, inside your own family. You just can't see it. You're too busy reading reports to look at the actual people around you. She backed away, her heart a shattered wreck, but her dignity intact. As for your money, she said, her voice dropping to an icy calm, you can keep it. My service as an interpreter had a price, but my integrity does not. I quit. She turned and walked toward the door, her back ramrod straight. My driver will take you home, Julian called after her, his voice suddenly uncertain. Her fierce, detailed counter-accusation had shaken him. He had expected tears, denials, begging, not this cold, surgical fury. Clara paused at the door, but didn't look back. Don't bother, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. I'll find my own way out of this gilded cage. And with that, she was gone, leaving Julian Thorne alone in the heart of his empire, the glittering city lights mocking him. For the first time, he felt a chilling premonition that in his effort to expose a phantom threat, he had just been played for a fool by a true one. The silence that descended upon the Thorne penthouse after Clara's departure was heavier and more suffocating than ever before. Julian had what he thought he wanted. The threat was gone, the fortress secure, but the victory felt like ashes in his mouth. The first crack in his certainty appeared the next morning. Eleanor emerged from her suite, her face expectant, and looked for Clara. When Julian, through a series of clumsy gestures and scribbled notes, explained that Clara's contract was over, the light in his mother's eyes didn't just die, it was extinguished. She stared at him, her expression hardening from confusion to a cold, unfamiliar fury. She snatched the notepad from him and wrote in a sharp, slashing script, You drove her away, the first person to truly see me in years. What did you do, Julian? His written reply, It was complicated, Mother. For the best was met with a look of such profound disappointment that it struck him harder than any shouted words ever could. Eleanor retreated to her rooms, and a new kind of silence began. It was not the silence of isolation, but the silence of judgment. It was a weapon, and it was aimed directly at his heart. Clara's accusation about the hearing aids gnawed at him. It was too specific, too detailed to be a random fabrication. Driven by a gnawing unease, Julian bypassed his uncle and made a call directly to the family's longtime audiologist. He was brusque and demanding. Dr. Evans, I need the file on my mother's last 3 appointments, including all hardware invoices and fitting notes. Send it to me now. An hour later, the files arrived. The truth was laid bare in cold, clinical detail. The clinic had, on Graham's instruction, been fitting Eleanor with older, less expensive models for the last 3 years, while billing the foundation for top-of-the-line custom-molded devices. Graham was pocketing the difference, a sum that was paltry for a Thorne, but clearly part of a larger, more disturbing pattern. It was the tip of the iceberg. The lie was so petty, so insidious. Julian felt a cold dread creep up his spine. If Graham would cheat his own sister-in-law on her medical care, what else was he doing? He unleashed the full, terrifying power of Thorne Industries' forensic accounting team on the Foundation's books. He didn't want a summary. He wanted every line item, every wire transfer, every expense report managed by Graham Thorne for the past 5 years. The result was a quiet, systematic, and utterly devastating portrait of betrayal. Graham had been running a sophisticated scheme, siphoning millions. He would approve grants to small, underfunded arts and community programs, organizations too small and too grateful to ever question a shortfall from a benefactor like the Thorne Foundation. A portion of the funds would be diverted through a labyrinth of shell corporations, eventually landing in his own offshore accounts. The motive was suddenly, chillingly clear. Graham needed Eleanor to remain a silent, passive figurehead who signed whatever was put in front of her. Clara, by giving Eleanor her voice back, had become the single greatest threat to his criminal enterprise. When Eleanor started to engage, to potentially ask questions, Graham panicked. He needed to eliminate Clara, to discredit her so thoroughly that Julian would cast her out, and the Eleanor problem would be neutralized. He hadn't just used Clara's past against her. He had weaponized Julian's own cynicism and protective instincts against him. Julian sat in his silent office, the city lights blurring through the window. The weight of his own monstrous actions crashed down upon him. Blinded by Graham's lies and his own arrogant prejudice, he had savaged an innocent woman. He had taken her kindness and called it a crime. He had taken her pain and called it a weapon. He had broken her heart, and in doing so, he had broken his mother's. An apology was a pathetic, meaningless gesture. Words were cheap. He knew with absolute soul-crushing certainty that he had to earn her forgiveness, and that would require an act of restitution as profound as the damage he had inflicted. 2 weeks later, Clara was volunteering at the community center in her neighborhood, teaching a free art class to a group of rambunctious kids. It was her refuge, the only place the hollow ache in her chest seemed to ease. She had gone back to her waitressing job at Le Ciel, a decision that felt both humbling and strangely empowering. Mr. Dubois, to her astonishment, had treated her with a new, profound respect. Her quiet defiance had become the stuff of kitchen legend. The community center was buzzing. A mysterious, anonymous donor had gifted the center a massive sum, enough to not only erase its debts, but to build a brand new wing dedicated to arts education for children with disabilities. Today was the groundbreaking ceremony. As Clara helped set up easels, the familiar silent black town car pulled up to the curb. Her heart seized. Julian Thorne stepped out. He wasn't wearing an immaculate suit, but a simple gray cashmere sweater and dark trousers. He looked weary, humbled, and completely out of place among the cracked pavement and chain-link fences. He didn't come to her. Instead, he approached the center's director, a kindly woman named Maria, and spoke with her for several minutes. Maria's eyes widened, and she looked from Julian to Clara and back again, a look of dawning wonder on her face. Then Julian walked towards her. The children paused their games, watching the tall, imposing man approach their teacher. Clara stood her ground, her arms crossed, her expression a careful, neutral mask, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Clara," he began, his voice low and raw, "I know saying I'm sorry is not enough. Words are what I use to hurt you. They aren't fit to heal you." He stopped a few feet from her, and then he did something that shattered her defenses. He lifted his hands. His movements were hesitant, awkward, the syntax clumsy, but his expression was one of desperate, profound sincerity. He began to sign. "I was wrong." He signed slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was clear he had been practicing, drilling the unfamiliar movements into his muscle memory. "I hurt you and my mother. My heart is sorry." Clara stared, her anger warring with a tidal wave of astonishment. This man, this titan of industry, had humbled himself to learn her language. Not for his mother, but for her. To apologize in the only way that would transcend the damage his spoken words had caused. He wasn't finished. "The man you met," he said, switching back to spoken words, "was a coward. He was raised to see threats in every shadow and plots in every kindness. You showed him what integrity looked like, and he was too blind and too arrogant to recognize it." He took a deep breath. "Graham has been removed. He will face the legal consequences for what he has done. The money he stole, and more, is being returned to every charity he defrauded." He took one more step closer, his eyes pleading. "His betrayal doesn't excuse mine. I chose to believe the worst in you because it was easier than questioning my own cynical world. That was my failure, not yours." At that moment, Maria stepped up to the small makeshift podium. "Everyone," she announced, her voice beaming, "I am honored to introduce the man responsible for our center's new future. Our benefactor has not only funded our new building, but has also established a permanent endowment in honor of his mother, the Eleanor Thorne Foundation for the Arts and Hearing Sciences. And he has created a new permanent scholarship for aspiring young artists from this community to ensure they can follow their dreams. It will be called the Leo Hayes Grant." Clara's head snapped towards Julian, her eyes wide with disbelief. The Leo Hayes Grant. He hadn't just righted a wrong, he had listened. He had heard everything she had told him about her brother, about her own sacrificed dreams, and he had honored them in the most public, permanent, and profoundly personal way imaginable. Tears finally welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of pain or anger. They were tears of overwhelming, complicated grace. Julian looked at her, his guard completely down, revealing a raw vulnerability she never thought possible. I can't undo the damage I did that night, Clara, but I hope to spend a very long time trying to build something good from the wreckage. My mother misses her friend terribly. He paused, his voice dropping. And I miss the woman who taught me that the most important things in the world are often communicated without a single sound. He held out his hand, not for a handshake, but as an open, hopeful offering. The new foundation needs a director, someone with passion, integrity, and a true understanding of the community it's meant to serve. Someone who sees the world not just for what it is, but for what it could be. Someone with an artist's eye. The world around them, the noisy children, the crumbling building, the promise of a new future, seemed to fade. It was no longer a story about a billionaire and a waitress. It was a story about two people who had seen the worst and the best in each other. It was about a second chance, not just for forgiveness, but for a true partnership. Slowly, a small, watery smile touched Clara's lips. She looked at the hopeful faces of the children, at the promise of a building where dreams like hers and Leo's could be nurtured, and at the man who had torn her world apart and was now painstakingly trying to piece it back together, better and stronger than before. She did not take his outstretched hand. Instead, she lifted her own. Let's get to work, she signed,